Imagine you are writing it decades later, and for some crazy reason, you want to fabricate a biography of Jesus, and to give it credibility, you want to attach a name to it. Why in the world would you attach the name of such an obscure person? He's not one of the apostles. He's not an eyewitness. It makes no sense whatsoever unless it really was written by somebody called Mark.
Hey everyone, happy Sunday. Today's show is all about biblical reliability. And more specifically, we're going to drill down into the authorship of the Gospels. Maybe you grew up in church and just assumed, or maybe you were taught that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were in fact written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then maybe you were perusing social media one day, you saw a TikTok video that pointed out that none of the Gospels actually make this claim of themselves. And that's actually true. If you look at Matthew's gospel, it doesn't say, I, Matthew, am writing this gospel, or I, Mark, am writing this gospel. So does this mean that the gospels were not written by eyewitnesses? We're going to discuss all of this and all the arguments surrounding the reliability of the gospels with our friend and New Testament scholar, Adam Claason, in just a moment. But I want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Brave Books. Brave Books is a Christian children's entertainment company, and you can check them out by going to bravebooks.com/childers for 20% off your purchase. I am so excited for you to hear this conversation with Adam. He addressed some of the claims that are brought against the traditional authorship of the Gospels, and specifically the ones we already discussed, but also the claim that the Gospels were written much later and they're legendary developments and maybe written by people who were pretending to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We're going to discuss all of that in today's episode. Here's Adam Claason. First of all, Adam, welcome. So glad to have you back. But how important is it that we see the Gospels as eyewitness accounts? Like, what significance does that have to our faith?
I think the importance of it is that if you think about the work of a historian, it's analogous to that of a lawyer. So in a court case, when you're with the prosecution or the defense, your case is often predicated and its success is based on the evidence that you provide, right? And so often the most important piece of evidence, and upon which court cases have turned 180 degrees, will be that of an eyewitness. Why? Because that person was there. Now, either they were there or it's a person who knew the person who was there, but the proximity to what's being talked about is really important for historians. Now, this is true in the ancient world. And of course, the Gospels are written in the ancient world, the Greco-Roman period, the classical world. And if you think about historians like Polybius or Thucydides or Tacitus, Josephus, they considered proper, real history and the most productive or fruitful history to have been written in the time of, or very close to the time of, the person that lived, if it's a biography, or the events, if it's a more general historical work. So they considered it to be vitally important. And of course, the Gospels are actually from that period, and they reflect those kinds of ideas. Now, my own work as a historian, I specialize in kind of First and Second World War history. And I got asked a decade and a half ago to write a history about the New Zealanders who had served in the Battle of Britain. I know this seems an obscure topic compared to talking about the Gospels, but this is sort of the bread and butter of what historians do. And so I got kind of commissioned to do this work. There was 135 of these New Zealanders. But by the time I started my research a decade and a half ago, of the 135, there were only 4 left alive. I got to interview 3 of them, which was super cool. Wow. And super informative. And these people were, the people I got to speak to were pretty sharp and had really good memories. They were all in their 90s. But here's the thing that gave weight to what I was saying in my book. Yes, I could use written documents. I could use secondary sources from other historians. But what really set my book apart was I was able to interview these people. And so I was able to speak to a man who had been shot down over the English Channel. His aircraft had crashed into the water. He had been knocked out. He came round. The gunner in his fighter he drowned because he could not get out. So he was, he relayed all of this sort of thing to me and told me the story, which became this part of this rich narrative of what I was writing, and it gave it weight. And that's what happens in a court case. The eyewitness, and that's true for historians. So if you think of someone like a guy like Stephen Ambrose writing about D-Day, right? Stephen, how many books has Stephen Ambrose written about D-Day and Normandy? So it almost feels like it's a dozen of them. But the weight of those books, it means they do so well, is in part because of the use of eyewitnesses that he had access to. Or you think about the series Band of Brothers, where at the beginning of each episode, you have these kind of vignettes of people who were veterans, right? And so, the story's cool. The series is cool, but you've got this authenticity that's provided by the eyewitnesses. Now, the Gospels fall into this type of genre of text. And we know this from Peter, right? So in 2 Peter, as we'll probably talk about, Peter is a primary source for the synoptic gospels, and of course for Mark's gospel principally. But if you think about what Peter said in 2 Peter, he says, "For we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." Now, some translations have the word fable in there. This idea of cleverly devised fables. So what's he doing? He's saying, listen, these are not works of fiction. What I say verbally, orally, or what has been written down that I've said, this is something I saw. I was an eyewitness to this. That adds weight to it. And and I think Luke's gospels are Luke is really cool, because here we've got a guy, quite possibly Gentile. He's coming at from a historian's perspective. He's commissioned for this task. Most people don't realize this. You look at Luke's gospel and you think, oh, Luke, why is he writing this? Well, I think it's pretty clear that he talks about Theophilus at the beginning of it. It's clear that Theophilus, I think, is the person who's commissioned this, probably helped pay for it. And so he said, hey, I want you to write a book about Jesus, and Luke's gospel is the outcome of that commissioning. And what does he start with? I have PhD students, right? And so one of the key things for a historical thesis is that in their introduction, they provide a methodology. So in history, a methodology is, how am I going to approach this task? What are the methods I'm going to use? Are they worthy methods of this type of critical thinking endeavor? Luke does the same thing 2,000 years ago. He says in here, Luke 1:4, insomuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of those things accomplished amongst us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the beginning eyewitnesses. So what's his methodology? He's saying, I have spoken to the people who were had direct access to who? The witnesses. So I think all of this, and of course, John says the same thing in his first epistle. We've got this gospel by John, and then what's John's methodology? He says that which was from the beginning, that which we heard, that's what we've seen with our own eyes, which we looked upon, our hands have handled, which of course is that beautiful imagery of, in a way, the Last Supper, where he's leaning against Jesus. So what's the criteria for believing these stories in the Gospels? Well, in part, it's because they say that they are based on eyewitness accounts, and they give evidence for it. And it was a methodology that was important in the first century, just as it is today with modern historians.
Mm-hmm. And for me, this is so important, and I place so much emphasis on them being eyewitness testimony, because the way that I reason to even the truthfulness of Christianity is I don't actually start with the presupposition that the Bible is true. Now, there's kind of two different schools of thought in our apologetics world, and I want everybody to get together because I think both can be effective. But I don't necessarily begin with that presupposition. What I want to reason to is, can we trust the Gospels as eyewitness testimony to tell us the truth about Jesus' life? And then if they tell the truth about Jesus' life, then we can go to what Jesus had to say about the Scriptures to that's how we know that the Bible in its entirety is the Word of God. When Jesus Jesus quoted from the Old Testament scriptures over and over and over again. He referred to them as the word of God, the command of God. He said, God said to you, and then he'll quote from the Old Testament. So that's how my reasoning works. So it's very important that these are eyewitness accounts, but a lot of people don't believe that these days. I've noticed that in my comments. I'll write a blog post, maybe something about the reliability of the Gospels, and someone will say, well, we can't really trust them because they were written decades later by people that weren't really there.
Right.
And so it's important that we realize these really are eyewitness accounts.
I think, yeah, I agree. I mean, there's been two across the 20th century, two kind of principal ways of looking at the Gospels. One is the form criticism, which arose out of kind of German scholarship and skepticism. And that said, these Gospels are written from anonymous. There were originally eyewitnesses, but the stories have become separated from those eyewitnesses. So the stories have a degree of anonymity now. We can't work out where they came from, who they directly came from. Then they were passed down over a long period of time through various Christian communities who changed them to suit their regional location or social needs at the time. And then in the final kind of analysis, can we completely trust them to be free of error, given the fact of the long time and things around what some you might call Chinese whispers. I don't know if you've heard that, you've got that expression in America, but it's this idea, everyone sits around or broken telephone's another name for it. Everyone sits around in a circle and someone starts off at the beginning by saying, Adam is amazing. And by the time you get to the 20th person, it's something like, Madam is crazy.
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
So this kind of errors come in, and before you know it, you discover that the job of the historian in this sense, or the scholar, is not to take it as this is the word of God, but this is something for us to pick apart so that we can remove all of those barnacles that have been attached to the original stories so that we can get to the truth, this kind of the quest for the historical Jesus, because we can't trust the gospel. So that was one perspective. The other perspective is the idea of faithful transmission. And this idea in the 20th century is around that the stories may have been separated from the original storytellers, the eyewitnesses. There was a long period of time, but given the Jewish emphasis on oral tradition and fidelity to what was originally said and retaining that we can trust the Gospels. And then finally, if you throw in the kind of evangelical Christian Protestant view, is that, of course, it's a small, if God can send his son to die for our sins and raise him from the dead, it is a very small thing for him to preserve these stories as they were originally given. So that's the faithful transmission. So you've got this form criticism, faithful transmission, kind of against each other. And that helps explain the kind of dialogue that's going on between these two groups. But what's really happened, and this is what I find exciting in what historians would call the historiography of Jesus and how we approach him, is the work of Richard Borkham and his 2006 book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, in which he argues for eyewitness primacy as a model. So you've got form criticism, you have got faithful transmission, but we've got this eyewitness primacy. And so he makes an incredibly strong case, which has completely upturned the conversation. And of course, it's what we're talking about today. It's this idea that in actual fact, it's not really a long period of transmission, that when the Gospels were written, it is easily conceivable that there are people who were alive when Jesus was alive, who had been his disciples, who had been his followers, who may have been his critics when the Gospels were written. And these people could have been drawn upon for the contents in the Gospels. Now, that is a revolutionary thought. And I think, worthy of discussion, which is what we're doing.
We love Brave Books in our home. Not only have they created a great line of children's books that enforce biblical values and character traits. Remember when you were in school as a kid and they taught you about things like honesty and putting others first and being brave and courageous? Well, I love that there are so many books that have been written by some friends of ours like Frank Turek and Kirk Cameron and Melissa Doherty that are really going to strengthen your child's faith and teach them good values as well. And also remember those shows you used to watch when you were younger and maybe some of your older kids were younger, when the shows didn't jump from scene to scene and give your kid this short attention span? Well, they've curated a wonderful streaming platform called Brave Plus that you can check out some shows like that that reinforce biblical values, but also don't cater to that short attention span. This is definitely something you're going to want to check out. You can go to bravebooks.com/childers today, and you're going to get 20% off your first purchase. Again, that's bravebooks.com/childers. Well, you mentioned the Gospel of Luke, and obviously people laud Luke as this really impeccable historian. And there's a reason why at Christmas time, everybody reads Luke's account of the birth of
Mhm.
Jesus. And there's some very specific details about things regarding Mary that you might be asking, how would Luke have known what Mary pondered in her heart or what was going on? And do you think that he interviewed Mary for the Gospel of Luke?
Look, I honestly think it's highly likely and highly possible. And these are the questions where. So if you take take Mark's gospel, how do we know Mark's gospel was based on an eyewitness account? And Luke. We'll get back to Luke in a second. We have a good reason to believe this. One is, of course, Papias lives between 50 to 130 AD, right? So he is one of these half a dozen people that are direct connections with the apostolic age into the 2nd century. So when our man Papias is in his 50s, he's John the Apostle is still alive. And people often don't think about this. And so Papias said that John the Elder said that Mark's gospel came from interviewing and traveling with Peter. And how do we know that Mark's gospel is based on Peter's account? There's lots of evidence for this. One, we have this direct link with an apostolic or disciple source. Some people contest whether he's talking about John, the son of Zebedee, or another of the disciples, perhaps one of the 70 or 72. But essentially he's saying, listen, this is where I got it from. And it was based on what Peter had said. And so you've got this direct link. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to say we don't have sufficient evidence. We've got something really early here. But think about the internal literary evidence. In the ancient world, one of the ways you could indicate where your sources came from or your principal source for what you're writing was the use of an inclusio. And that would be mentioning the name of that person at the beginning of your book and at the end. For example, my book on the men of the Battle of Britain, the historical source that was most useful to me, I did this not intentionally, but it's the way it turned out. But it turns out that I was part of this long historical tradition going back at least to the classical realm. I had an inclusio to this guy, also called John, by the way, living in Tauranga in the North Island of New Zealand, and he had flown in the Battle of Britain. The guy I told you had been shot down. So I started off my book with his story, right? Because it was really dramatic. I ended it with his passing away.
Mm.
So I had this bookend to my book, which indicated who was my main eyewitness account that I had used in my book. Now, here's the thing about Mark's gospel. In the ancient world, this was a reasonably common practice. Richard Bauckham gives lists of the kind of biographical books that include this. And who's the first disciple mentioned in Mark's gospel? It's Peter. Who's the last disciple mentioned in Mark's gospel? It's Peter. Now, we know that Luke based a lot of his work and his research and his writing clearly on Mark's gospel because there's a lot of Mark's content found in Luke's gospel, which makes sense, especially if Mark's gospel was written earlier. And Luke has an inclusio. Who's the first disciple he mentions? It is Peter. Who's the last? It's Peter. So it's this, and so you've got, and John's gospel has inclusio as well. He doesn't name himself. John's too modest, or he doesn't feel it's appropriate. But clearly, he's the author of his own. He's talking about his own eyewitness experiences. But the first disciple mentioned after that is kind of like a double inclusio. So John's at the beginning, John's at the end. But who's the next person that appears of significance amongst the disciples? It's Peter, and who at the end? It's Peter. So I think the role of Peter in all of this is really important, and it makes perfect sense, because we know, in fact, that Mark travelled a lot with Peter. A lot.
Mm-hmm.
And we, as we discover in one of his letters, I'm trying to think of which letter it is, at the end of it, he talks about Mark being his son. Now, he's clearly not his biological son, but what he's talking about is closeness of relationship. And, when Peter gets out of prison in the book of Acts, whose house does he go to? Well, it's the house of John Mark. That may have been the first time they met, may not have been, but he spent lots of time with him. And what would have Mark been talking to Peter the most about? Hey, tell me about that story about that guy who was lowered down in the roof, on that day and got healed. Tell me that story about the person whose eyesight was recovered. Tell me this story. So I think, and I kind of think there are other examples of where people aren't named, but you've got people who are named. And there is this idea that historians are suggesting that when people are specifically named, it's because they are the eyewitness upon which the gospel writers are basing their story. So when it talks about who was at the foot of the cross in John's gospel, when it talks about who the women were, who were the first to discover that Jesus had risen from the dead, that, when they're named, it's very strongly suggestive that these stories were associated with them because they were either interviewed by the gospel writers, or they were just so heavily associated in the minds of Christians at the time with these specific people.
In a world of mass-produced disposables, Range Leather really stands apart. I remember early in the pandemic, an ad came into my algorithm for a leather bag from a different company. I ordered the bag, and when it arrived, it was small, it was flimsy. I ended up receiving a similar tote bag from Range Leather. The difference was so big. This bag was bigger, it was buttery, the leather was thick and beautifully made, and the more that I wore it in, the more beautiful it actually still becomes. I also have a clutch from Range that literally I can't live without. I take it everywhere I go. It's basically my wallet because I don't always like to carry a big bag around. So I just grab that clutch. It has room for my phone, a lipstick, my cards, a little bit of cash. It's perfect. Every product that they craft in their Laramie, Wyoming workshop is built to last a lifetime, just like the values they and you and me hold dear. This is a Christian-owned company. Really want to encourage you to check them out. Go to rangeleather.com and you can use my code Alisa for 15% off. Again, rangeleather.com. Use my code Alisa. Right. So for anybody who's new to the Bible, let me give a little summary, and you can add some thoughts to this, and I have a question for you as well. But if you think about the four Gospels, you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Matthew was an eyewitness himself. He was one of Jesus' disciples. Mark was not an eyewitness, but you're basically saying that Mark is essentially Peter's gospel. Mark was the one who wrote down the thoughts and eyewitness testimony of Peter. Then you have Luke, who was also not an eyewitness, correct? Himself, and
It
right.
doesn't appear so. And it looks like when he's saying his methodology, he's saying he's basing what he has to say on the eyewitnesses or people who knew the eyewitnesses.
Right. So he's interviewing eyewitnesses as a historian. And then you have John, who actually was an eyewitness himself. I think that's important to kind of make that distinction for people. And am I correct in saying that for the first, 100 or 200 years or so of church history, the authorship of those Gospels was not in question? The church always believed Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John. It's really more of a more modern idea that they were written decades later by people who were just maybe using their name as a pseudonym or something like that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get that last point the idea it's a pseudonym and it's not related to anybody. Here's one of the strengths, I think, for the fact that Mark's gospel was written by a person called Mark. Imagine you are writing it decades later, and for some crazy reason, you want to fabricate a biography of Jesus, and to give it credibility, you want to attach a name to it. Why in the world would you attach the name of such an obscure person? He's not one of the apostles. He's not an eyewitness. It makes no sense whatsoever unless it really was written by somebody called Mark. I mean, if we didn't have a gospel called the Gospel of Mark, all that even Christians would know is probably about the dispute between Paul and Barnabas. It was over Mark. That's really all anyone would know about. It'd be a footnote in history. So to pick someone so obscure makes no sense whatsoever. So I think that's a real strength for the fact that it probably was written by Mark. Also in the second century, we've got the Diatessaron, we've got texts which talk about, the harmony of the Gospels. Clearly there's four and only four. And where we do have names being given, they are. And I kind of feel, this does come from the second century, but we do have Papias who spans the first and the second century. He's living in Hierapolis. This is a region in, near the seven churches of the book of Revelation. And it's a place associated with Philip and his prophetical daughters. You've got people who are traveling through this area all the time, including disciples. So the kind of connections. And I kind of think when a book comes out, so say you're a Christian in the first century, I think it's incredibly naive to think that people didn't know who wrote it. So imagine all you had was like a box of scriptures, right, which might include some Paul's epistles. Maybe that's all you have, a couple of epistles. And you have visiting disciples and believers who tell their stories on a first day of the week. So, we're in like 60 AD. And then suddenly you hear of a book that's been written, a biography about this person you believe in. What's the first question you're going to ask, Alisa? Who's the publisher? How much does it cost? Now, the first question is, oh, wow, who wrote it?
Mm-hmm.
It's inconceivable. Firstly, the person who wrote it knew who wrote it. So the idea that it was completely anonymous is not the case because the author knew. And then the people closest, when it was transmitted and given to other people, what would be the natural thing that you would do if I was to give it to you in the year 60? And I said, Alisa, here's this narrative of Jesus of Nazareth. It was written by this guy Mark, who got all of the stuff from the Apostle Peter. So you should probably give it some credence, right?
Right.
I mean, just use a little bit of creative, imaginative logic. People in the first century knew who wrote it. The fact that we don't have this, and Papias' link seems to me to be fairly strong. He's not the only one. But it's just got no credibility.
Well, and you've got Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr also referring to them as the memoirs of the apostle. I know of the apostles, you have Irenaeus who specifically mentioned all four, and this is all in the second century. So this is not like, I think it's reasonable. I think I'm not a historian, you are, but would it be reasonable? I'll ask you, would it be reasonable to assume that this was the assumption among the church, is that the people who they believed wrote it, they really did write it? And that was their memoirs, of course, with Mark recording the memoirs of Peter, of course.
Yeah, and I mean, if there were other contenders, why don't we have one single example of an alternative name for any of the four Gospels at any time in this period? Not that I'm aware of. It makes absolutely no sense. I mean, the question could be asked: why don't the writers put their names to the text themselves? That would have cleared up a lot of this sort of stuff, wouldn't it? If at the end of it, Peter had, Mark had said, "Hey, I Mark, John Mark, referenced in the book of Acts, dweller in Jerusalem, periodically, I wrote this." There's lots of reasons why a person might not have done that, and I think first just as a possibility, is the idea of, and this sounds anachronistic, but I want to just think about it, is the idea of a medieval guild. And in the medieval guild, lots of things that were produced don't actually have authors or signature names to it because people felt they were corporate activities or projects or outcomes that were representative of the whole body, not for somebody to take complete claim for. So maybe Mark felt, I am part of this Jewish tradition, which he certainly felt he was. The interesting thing, it seems to me, and this is stuff that's been raised by people even like Bart Ehrman, is that clearly Mark sees himself as being in the tradition of the Old Testament writers. Where does he start his gospel off with? He starts off by linking Jesus with the prophecies of the Old Testament. And John the Baptist, and it's this kind of continuity of Jewish scholarship. So I kind of feel there's something in that. Why put my name to something like that? And particularly if I feel, and I think the other thing is maybe the distraction. In the modern world, we're really heavy into IP, intellectual property rights, eh?
Mm-hmm.
And how do I know it's a genuine painting? Because someone's put a signature on it. Every piece of work, we've got to protect ourselves now that AI is just stealing it all,
No.
which is why artists get so upset. So you've got to have these intellectual property rights. That's a more modern context, those sorts of concerns that we have. We shouldn't impose those on the past. And there are certainly artists in the past who didn't sign their paintings. Why? Because they felt it was a distraction.
If you haven't tried 7 Weeks Coffee yet, you really need to check them out. I love that 7 Weeks Coffee is America's pro-life coffee company. In fact, they're called 7 Weeks Coffee because at 7 weeks, the baby is the size of a coffee bean. And that's also the first time you can clearly detect a heartbeat on the ultrasound. And they've built their business around saving lives by donating 10% of every sale to pregnancy centers and pro-life organizations all across the country. And thanks to so many of you who have subscribed to 7 Weeks Coffee, they've now raised over $1 million and saved thousands of lives. Now, I love the coffee because I'm kind of picky. I like my coffee to be mold-free, pesticide-free, shade-grown, low-acid, organically farmed. 7 Weeks Coffee checks all of these boxes. So go to 7 Weeks Coffee today and you will save 15% forever when you subscribe. Plus, you're going to get a free gift with your order. But that's not all. If you use my code Alisa, you're going to get an extra 10% off of your first order. So that's 25% off of your first order plus that free gift. Check them out today. Go to 7weekscoffee.com. Use my code Alisa. Yeah. Okay, so
It's an unnecessary distraction, particularly if everyone knows that I wrote it in the first century anyway. Why? Because it's been circulated in my name.
right.
So those are just a few thoughts.
Okay, so let's think this through. We know there was a bit of a lower the lifespan was lower back in the first century. And I've heard people present this as a possible idea, like how could they have written, because, if you look at the dating of when the Gospels were actually written, the lifespan was a little bit shorter. So how do we know that they were actually living long enough to be within living memory, as we say?
I think this is at first flush, this is a real valid question because we know that average life expectancy is between 20 to 30 years of age, right? So, so that means by the time you're hitting about 15, you're already in that midlife crisis as if you're a male and you're having to buy that red sports car. No, I've only got 15 more years to go. But here's the thing, that number is based on, an average, and it's based predominantly on death and childbirth, excessive death and childbirth, high infant mortality due to things like smallpox, and then and diseases, and of course an outrageously demoralizing high level of infanticide that was practiced in the ancient world. So that is the killing of your own children, which was perfectly permissible and legal in the Roman Empire for a father to do, which meant either leaving the child in the wilderness to die of exposure, to be devoured, or the active killing of children. That was the norm. And so that meant that, but so maybe half the population lives, children make it to their 10th birthday, right? But if you lived to your 10th birthday, you had a good chance of living till you were 40, 50, 60. And so people don't seem to realize that. So, the disciples can clearly easily be in their 50s or 60s. That's not a problem. And if they're in their 30s, well, and if you think about people from the ancient world, think about the emperor of the Roman Empire when Jesus was born, which is Caesar Augustus. He lives till he is 77 years of age. Jesus' life and ministry was across the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. He lives until he is 79. Cato the Elder, I think 85. Cicero's wife, 103. Okay, it's
Wow.
that Mediterranean diet. It's that
Yeah,
Mediterranean
yeah.
diet. Olives and virgin olive oil, fish, omega oils, and all that sort of stuff. So they're doing all the good things, and they don't have all the pesticides and microplastics and the kind of over-processed food we have today. So it is possible, even without our modern healthcare and everything else, people will live to the kind of lengths of lives that we live today in smaller numbers. But historical demographers estimate that about 10% of the population in this period probably lived beyond their 70th birthday. 10%. So let's think about that for a second. The Roman Empire at the time of Jesus is roughly 60 million. Okay, so if it's 60 million, that means there are 6 million people in the Roman Empire that are living beyond their 70th birthday. Now, if we take the province of Judea and this general region in which Jesus is in the first century, and that's got a population of about 600,000, historians kind of suggest. That means in Jesus' lifetime, there were at least about 60,000 people living beyond their 70th birthday. And to labor the point, even just down to Jerusalem, we don't know the exact figures for the population of Jerusalem in Jesus' time, but the people who are experts on this, the archaeologists and everything, they say that probably about 50 to 60,000 people. Now, of course, this ballooned out when you had Tabernacles, Passover, Pentecost, etc., where you had all these pilgrims coming in. But the average population, about 60,000. That means that even when Jesus is walking through the streets of Jerusalem, he's in the temple teaching, there's about 6,000 people in that city who are older than 70, right? So what does all that mean? What does all that mean? It means that, say, if Mark's gospel is written around 50 to 60, if we want to put a date on it, say 60, the disciples are going to be, if they were about 30 years of age when they met Jesus, some of them, that they're only, they are going to be 60, or if it's early at 50, or if they're younger. But it also means that even when John wrote his gospel, right, which we know was in the 80s or the 90s, if he was a teenager, and this seems highly likely, most historians believe that he was in his, what we would call the teenage years, say he was 15 or so. It means that, so by the time Jesus is 30, John's 15, 16, 17, it means by the time he gets to write his gospel, that he is, kind of in his 70s. I interview people in their 90s for work that I write. I mean, I recently wrote a book, a biography about an airman from the First World War. I got to speak to his daughter, his eldest daughter, still alive, as she was in her 90s.
Wow.
And I don't think people realize this. So this kind of this idea that all these people were dying in their 20s and 30s, then a next generation came along, then a next. No, what we have is quite a few individuals who were there with Jesus, the apostles, the 70. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says there were 500 who had seen him after he rose from the dead, and many of which are still alive. And that was written around 50, that epistle. We've got people who are living all the way through. And this is this idea of a continuing witness, not one just handed down, but people who were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who were still telling these stories. I mean, I still tell stories about my kids today, about their exploits. This is aging me, but 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And I'm not that dim-witted to get it so wrong. These stories, and
Well,
I
okay,
kind of
so
feel, and I feel there's a self-correcting thing in this, Alisa, as well. Say someone got it wrong, and you've got a whole group of people together. What happens when you're sitting on the couch in your lounge and someone says something, and it's slightly wrong? Everyone piles in and say, no, it was actually the day before Memorial Day. You have remembered this incorrectly. And when you've got 12 apostles and you've got all these other people who were at all these events, it's kind of like the story, there's a self-correcting mechanism anyway.
right, right. Well, so and that's a great point because especially when these gospels were being circulated, there were a lot of people that were still alive that were there that could have said, "Hey, wait a second, even those 500." That's pretty bold of Paul to mention 500 eyewitnesses. He said some of them have passed on, but some are still here. That's a very bold claim to write that, knowing that a lot of those people are still alive and could have said, "Well, hey, wait a second, I was there and that's not what happened." But of course, he wouldn't have put that in there if it wasn't true because there would have been so many people that could have refuted it. But I think about when I used to travel in music. So we played all sorts of different venues. I mean, arenas on the Carmen tour. We played every
Mm.
kind of church you could possibly imagine. I I don't even remember most of them. In fact, people to this day, I'll go travel to do a speaking engagement and they'll say, "Have you ever been here before?" to whatever specific
Right.
town this is. And my answer is always, probably. I probably have. And they just look at me
Right.
like, and I say, I know that sounds crazy that I wouldn't remember if I've been to this city before, but I've been to so many cities that, and especially when you're touring on a tour bus, you go to bed at night on a tour bus and you wake up the next day in a new town. Sometimes I didn't even know where I was until I was getting on the bus to go to the next place. Like, where were we today? What was this? And so you
Yeah.
can, so if I think about if somebody were to say, "Hey, can you tell me what happened on this particular tour in Houston? You were in Houston on this day. What happened that day?" I would have no idea. I don't even know. I wouldn't even know what songs we sang. I wouldn't have necessarily known who we were on the tour with. And so somebody might say, with the how bad our memories are. I mean, many of us don't even remember what we had for lunch last week, and
Yeah.
yet you're expecting us to believe that these people are eyewitnesses and got all this stuff right.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's the next question, isn't it? So even if we've dealt with the argument of, well, no one could still be alive, and I think that's pretty easily refuted now, is how faithful, how good or useful would their memories be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 decades after the events they were participants in? And I've got a great story. I went to a lecture once with one of my 15-year-old son, and many years ago, when The Passion of the Christ came out, Mel Gibson's film.
Hmm.
And so we're in this lecture, and the academic who's speaking said something, was talking about the veracity of these stories and how they were portrayed in the film. And the person made this statement, around how could we expect the gospel writers to remember this stuff if you can't remember what you had for breakfast a month ago, right? And so I thought this kind of leads into what you're saying. How can you remember things faithfully over time that are worth actually recording and we can put trust in? And so I was driving home from this event. I was unhappy with this statement. I love the guy who said it, but I was unhappy with the statement. And my son there, he's 15. So what do you think about this? And I mean, it's almost like snap. He just said, "Well, I guess it depends what the event was, right? Out of the mouths of babes." Okay. So if I think that's true. And the funny thing about it is cognitive psychologists agree with my 15-year-old son. And here's what they say: events that are generally faithfully remembered over long periods of times, events and things that have these one or all or two or three of these components. They are unusual, they are consequential, and they are emotional. Now, my guess is, Alisa, that because it's like having breakfast, isn't it? Unless something significant happens at one of your breakfasts, you're not really going to remember what you had a month ago. Likewise, being on tour. You did so many. But my guess is there will be a few standout events or moments on those tours, maybe a crisis with people you're working with, a personal problem that occurred, something glorious and amazing that you just couldn't believe you were so fortunate to experience, right? And so you've got the mundane, but what you've also got is you've got the unusual thing that happens, the consequential thing that happens, and the emotional thing that happens. I'll give you an example of this in my own life. When my last son was born, we were, I know the name of the street in which the hospital was in. I can visualize the room in which my son was born in. I remember who the woman was. I'm joking. That's my wife. I remember all the stuff. And here's what happened on that day. So there was a real difficulty with the birth. He was born with the cord wrapped around his throat. He was grey. He was floppy. The midwife was concerned. She said, okay, we need to get oxygen for him, ASAP. So she took him from my wife to get oxygen. And as she did so, because he was so slippery, like a skinned rabbit, he slipped and slithered out of her arms, and he was heading towards the floor, head first. And in that split second reaction, she grasped him, grasped him by the
Oh.
ankle, and she was holding him upside down.
Oh my
Right?
goodness.
Okay, so
Wow.
so what is this? That never happened with any of the other kids, right? That was
Oh,
unusual.
yeah.
It was potentially consequential, and it was extremely emotional.
Mhm.
And so those sorts of things. And if you think about the life of Jesus, think about the life of the disciples beforehand. Many of them were fishermen. They went out, they fished, they went home. Next day, what did they do? One day, somebody turns up out of the blue who knows their thoughts, and he calls them to follow him. And inexplicably, they follow him. And it will turn out to be the biggest roller coaster ride in the history of history. I mean, you and I could live 1,000 lives and never experience what they experienced over 3 years.
Mhm.
The preaching of the gospel to thousands of people, the declaration of the kingdom of God,
Miracles.
the miracles, people being delivered under demonic oppression, blind people seeing, lame people
Mhm.
walking, dead people coming back to life. Talk about unusual, talk about consequential,
Right.
talk about emotional. So all of the stuff suggests to me that a lot of this is not your run of the mill. I was on a concert tour, but you know what I'm saying? Or what did I
Yeah.
have for breakfast?
Well, and
It's a
what's interesting about
significant.
the concert tour is I think about exactly what you're talking about. I do remember some things. I remember that you mentioned a crisis. We had a very difficult conversation with someone that was really determinative, if that's the word, of the future of our group. And it was a very intense conversation. I remember it was Charlotte, North Carolina. I remember exactly what I know. I remember the color of the carpet. I remember
Right.
that there were folding chairs in a circle in the dressing room. The mirrors were on this side. I remember what the person looked like we were talking to. I mean, there was so much significance to what happened in that moment that I remember. I remember all the people that were in the room, the people that came in, the people came out, and it was. I remember which tour it was. So there is. You're right. Even just in my own example, I remember
Mm,
the performing at the Ryman, and the reason I remember performing at the Ryman is because that's a significant venue. That's a famous venue.
right.
So you're going to park that in your mind. I remember what it felt like walking out on the stage. I actually remember what I was wearing. And I don't think there are any photos from that day. So it's not like from a photo. I remember I was wearing those gold sparkly pants, and the something happened with the
Yeah.
music, and I had to do a little bit of extra talking. And I remember the pressure of that. I mean, I remember so many things about what that
Yeah.
night was like. And so to your point, yeah, when something, this is the other thing, people often bring up the Titanic, how the eyewitness testimony from the Titanic was that half the people were saying that it sunk whole, and then the other half were saying it broke in half and then sunk. And we didn't know until recent history that it actually had broken in half. And so people will use that as an example, like, look at all these eyewitness. But the point that my friend Frank and other apologists bring up is, but what did they all remember? The Titanic sank, right? It was such a significant event. They might have even gotten their, maybe from this person's perspective, what they saw looked different than what somebody else saw. But the point is that they did all remember that the Titanic sank. That's the significant event. And I think that's something that people don't think through enough when we talk about the reliability of the Gospels. But we're kind of coming up at the end of our time here. Anything else you want to comment on about the eyewitness testimony of the Gospels? I mean, just maybe even for people who are new Christians and maybe they're faced with this claim where somebody's come into their social media feed, or maybe even someone in their life who is saying, well, actually, the church thinks that it was written by eyewitnesses and that it was eyewitness testimony, but it's really not. Is there any sort of just a summarized response that you could give for them to think about and maybe even articulate back to somebody?
I think what I would add into what we've already discussed is the final thing about this. I guess I'd emphasize the kind of archaeological evidence that supports the eyewitness accounts. It just seems too implausible to me as a historian that a guy like Luke could get so many things right. And also even John's gospel, which is more about internal dialogues and conversations. It's rich. It's replete with all of these cases of things that occurred at the time that are contemporaneously, taking place with what's being discussed. And this is the age before digital archives. This is the age before finding stuff on the internet, where you really have to be there or know people that are there to get these kinds of details right. And the kinds of titles of people. There was a lot of criticism of the New Testament about the title given for Pontius Pilate. How can we trust the Gospels when they've given an incorrect title to Pontius Pilate? Until archaeology discovered, this inscription from the period that gave the same title as used in the New Testament. And you can't I can't think of any archaeological finding that would contradict the Gospels or even Paul's letters. I think the other thing to consider about these stories as eyewitness ones, so the people live long enough. We also know that if it's unusual, consequential, and it is emotional, these memories are retained. But cognitive psychologists have one further thing to say, that stories that are consequential, unusual, and emotional are often repeated throughout the lifetime of the person who experienced it, thereby reinforcing the memory. It's not something that they just had once, but it's something they might have talked to other people about on other occasions that helps in the retention of what took place. Now, that is definitely true about the story about the birth of my youngest son. It's a story that I have told on various occasions, and that has reinforced it. And if you think about what happened to Jesus, if you were there at some miraculous event, how many times do you think you might have told that story? How many times do you think people pestered you? I mean, if you were a survivor from the Titanic, using that analogy, I bet you're constantly getting letters from people, or if they know who you are, they're asking you questions about it. There probably a month would go by if there was a Titanic survivor alive that they weren't pestered about it. I mean, this guy I wrote about from the First World War, he would get a letter a week. This is when he was in his 80s, a letter a week from people all around the world, because he had flown with very famous people in the First World War, and they wanted to know his thoughts about them, right? And so he was repeating these stories over and over. How much more in an oral society in which you got Philip turning up at your town, at your synagogue, or wherever, talking about Jesus? How often would he be asked these questions?
Right.
Multiple. I bet it wasn't a week, and my guess is for many of them, a day would go by. I mean, you're a Christian, I'm a Christian. there's probably, and I haven't personally met Jesus in the sense of the historical Jesus of 2,000 years ago, right? In his incarnation. I have met him in a spiritual sense. I've been born again. I've read the Gospels. I've believed them. I've put my trust in him. Something took place in my life. But I've lost my thoughts here. But, this idea of these people who knew him at the time, I think that's something powerful. And the eyewitness accounts as portrayed in the Gospels are trustworthy and certainly worth considering. And I'd start with the Gospel of John.
Yes, that's my advice too, especially if somebody is new to reading the Bible. Get to know Jesus, get to know your Lord and Savior, read the Gospel of John, and start from there. So thank you so much, Adam, for being with us. I want to tell everybody that I appreciate you listening and watching. If you're a brand new Christian and you're reading the Bible for the first time, I recommend you get a good study Bible. I recommend the Apologetics Study Bible. You can get it for about $20 on Amazon. The reason I like that one is because it's likely to address the questions and concerns and confusions that might arise for you as you're reading through the Bible. And I have found that one to be very helpful. There's a lot of good ones out there. Ali Bustecki recommends the ESV Study Bible. So there's lots of good stuff out there. And let's remember, as we pursue Christ, to keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin.